that occasionally grace the lives of scientists who are deeply embedded in their subject. The story of how he identified and located the fossil digger who had found critical new Spinosaurus material, a story involving a handwritten note from years earlier, a chance encounter in a market, and considerable determined searching, has become something of a legend in paleontological circles, and it illustrates both the informal human-scale nature of much fossil discovery and the determined persistence that characterizes the best scientists. The new material that Ibrahim and his colleagues incorporated into the 2014 Spinosaurus reconstruction was recovered primarily from the Kem Kem beds of Morocco, and it included elements, particularly from the hindlimbs and tail, that were crucial for resolving long-standing debates about the animal's posture and locomotion. The short, dense leg bones that the new material revealed, suggesting that Spinosaurus's hindlimbs were relatively short and robust compared to those of other large theropods, were particularly significant because they argued strongly against the idea of Spinosaurus as a fast-running terrestrial predator and in favor of an animal that spent significant time in water, where the relatively short hindlimbs would have been less of a disadvantage than on land. The tail vertebrae were, if anything, even more dramatic. The tall neural spines and broad hemal arches of the recovered caudal vertebrae formed, when assembled into a reconstruction, a tail of distinctly fin-like proportions, flexible, laterally expanded, and well-suited for the kind of undulatory swimming motion used by modern crocodilians and many fish. This was not a tail designed for an animal that ran bipedally on land. This was a tail designed for an animal that swam. The 2014 paper, published in Science to considerable scientific and popular attention, did not resolve every question about Spinosaurus, far from it. It opened new questions, stimulated new debates, and launched a wave of follow-up research that continues to this day. Subsequent studies have refined the details of the original, addressed some of the criticisms raised by skeptics, and in some cases modified specific aspects of the interpretation. Fundamental conclusion that Spinosaurus was a semi-aquatic predator, the most aquatically adapted large predatory dinosaur known to science, has proven robust to scrutiny and is now broadly accepted across the paleontological community. The ongoing research into Spinosaurus and the broader Kem Kem ecosystem represents, in many ways, the most exciting frontier of current work on Cretaceous dinosaurs and their ecosystems. Asked are fundamental ones. Systems support this density of how did niche partition practice, what behaviors and habitat preferences separated the different species, how did the seasonal monsoon cycle drive the ecological dynamics of the system, how fauna change over time as the environmental conditions of the region evolved, and ultimately, what does the existence of this extraordinary ecosystem tell us about the range of ecological strategies available to large vertebrates in the Cretaceous world. These questions are being lines of research, news in the field, and analysis of existing topic and reveal information and habitat use from the bone, and increasingly sophisticated ecological modeling that attempts to reconstruct the dynamics of ancient ecosystems from the biological and physical evidence available. Each approach yields partial answers, and the synthesis of these partial answers is slowly building toward a fuller understanding of the Kem Kem that would, one suspect, satisfied Ernst Stromer von Reichenbach, the man who first recognized that something extraordinary lay buried in the rocks of North Africa and who spent his career trying to bring it to light. The story of the Kem Kem is, at its heart, a story about the strangeness and the richness of life on Earth, about how, given the right conditions, nature can produce solutions to the challenge of living that exceed anything we might predict from first principles. It is a story about a river that ran for millions of years through a world we can barely imagine, sustaining giants of land and water and air in an ecological community of extraordinary complexity. It is a story about the fossils that are all that remains of that world, and about the scientists who have dedicated their professional lives to reading those fossils and recovering the knowledge they contain. And it is a story that is not finished. Every year new material comes out of the Kem Kem escarpment. Every year new analyses shed new light on old questions. Every year the picture of the ancient river and its inhabitants becomes a little sharper, a little more detailed, a little more astonishing. The lost world of the Kem Kem is being found again, one fossil at a time, by scientists who understand that in those fragments of ancient bone lie some of the most extraordinary stories that Earth's history has to tell. We have explored the foundation of that world, the river, the fish, the monsoon cycle, the niche partitioning, the extraordinary cast of predators and their ecological roles. We have followed the scientific history of the most remarkable of these creatures, Spinosaurus, from Stromer's first description through the tragic loss of the original specimens to Ibrahim's landmark 2014 reconstruction. We have considered the complexity of the ecosystem and the productivity that made its apparent paradoxes possible. In Part 2, we will go further still, into the details of how the individual animals of the Kem Kem lived their lives, into the specific ecology of predation and competition and coexistence, into the smaller creatures that completed the community, into the specific evidence that allows us to reconstruct not just what was there, but how it all worked together. And we will follow the Kem Kem to its end, to the rising seas of the Cenomanian-Tironian boundary, to the slow drowning of the ancient river, to the disappearance of the giants and the transformation of their world into something utterly unrecognizable. The river ran for millions of years, and then it was gone, but its story is not gone. It is here in the rocks, in the fossils, in the dedicated work of scientists who refuse to let the past be lost entirely. It is here in this exploration of a world that ended 100 million years ago, but that still has things to teach us about life, about ecology, about the extraordinary range of solutions that evolution finds to the challenge of being alive. The lost world of the Kem Kem, 100 million years of waiting, and finally now beginning to be understood. We left the ancient river at a moment of suspended drama, a moment balanced on the knife edge between the living world and the geological record, between the creature breathing and moving through warm Cretaceous water and the fossil pressed into stone for 100 million years of waiting. We left the Kem Kem at the height of its glory, teeming with life of extraordinary scale and variety, driven by the seasonal pulse of monsoon rains, organized by the ecological logic of niche partitioning into a community of giants that should not have been possible and yet demonstrably was. We met Spinosaurus, the semi-aquatic river titan whose scientific story spans more than a century of discovery, loss, and rediscovery. We understood the fish, the monsoon, the river itself as the engine of the entire extraordinary enterprise. Now we go deeper, into the daily reality of life in the ancient Kem Kem, the specific behaviors and hunting strategies of the predators, the defensive adaptations of the prey, the ecological relationships that bound every species in the community to every other species in a web of dependence and competition and coexistence. Into the smaller creatures whose importance to the ecosystem was every bit as real as that of the giants, even if they have captured less scientific and popular attention. Into the physical landscape in greater detail, the specific character of the ancient river, the floodplain, the seasonal transformations that define the rhythm of life for every creature in the community, and then ultimately into the end. Because every great story has an ending, and the story of the Kem Kem is no exception. The ancient river did not run forever. The world that sustained the giants eventually changed beyond the point where even the most perfectly adapted specialists could survive. The seas rose, the land changed, and the extraordinary community of the Kem Kem, millions of years in the making, calibrated to its particular environmental conditions with extraordinary precision, collapsed and was lost. Understanding how and why it ended is as important as understanding how and why it worked. Because in the ending of the Kem Kem lies a lesson about the relationship between ecological communities and the physical environments that sustain them. A lesson about fragility and resilience, about specialization and vulnerability, about the way that the very adaptations that make a species extraordinarily successful in one set of conditions can become liabilities when those conditions change. This is part 2 of the story of the lost world of the Kem Kem. Let us return to the river. To understand what daily life in the ancient Kem Kem was actually like, to move beyond the broad ecological framework we established in Part 1 and into the lived reality of individual animals navigating their world, we need to think carefully about what the fossil evidence tells us about behavior. Fossils, after all, are primarily records of anatomy. They tell us what animals looked like, how big they were, what their bones and teeth were shaped like. From these anatomical clues, we can make inferences about behavior, about how animals moved, what they ate, how they interacted with each other and with their environment. But the behavioral inferences are always interpretations, always reconstructions based on analogy with living animals and on the functional logic of the anatomical features we observe. With that caveat clearly in mind, let us think about what a day, or more precisely, what the behavioral ecology of a season in the ancient Kem Kem might have looked like for its inhabitants. Let us begin, as we must in any consideration of this ecosystem, with Spinosaurus, the animal whose behavior was most fundamentally defined by the river itself. Spinosaurus, as we have established, was a semi-aquatic predator whose anatomy was adapted for life in and around water in ways that distinguish it from every other large theropod dinosaur we know of. But what did semi-aquatic mean, in practical behavioral terms, for an animal of this extraordinary size? How did it actually hunt? Where did it spend its time? How did it interact with the other large predators in its ecosystem? The hunting strategy of Spinosaurus has been the subject of considerable scientific discussion, and the emerging consensus, informed by biomechanical analysis, by comparison with modern semi-aquatic predators of various kinds, and by the anatomical specifics of the Spinosaurus skeleton, is of an animal that employed multiple foraging strategies depending on the depth and character of the water it was operating in. In shallow water, the kind of water that dominated during the dry season, as the river contracted to its minimum extent, Spinosaurus was probably a wader and stalker, using its long neck and crocodilian-like skull to strike downward into the water at fish concentrated in the dwindling pools and channels. This strategy is broadly analogous to the fishing behavior of modern herons and storks, scaled up to the dimensions of a 12 to 14-meter dinosaur. The low, flat skull of Spinosaurus, with its long rostrum and its rosette of forward-pointing teeth at the tip, was ideally designed for this kind of strike from above fishing. A heron strikes with its beak from above the water surface, using the speed of its neck extension to impale or seize fish before they can escape. Spinosaurus, with proportionately similar skull geometry scaled to a vastly larger size, could have deployed a broadly analogous strategy, holding its head above the water surface, eyes watching for the movement of fish below, then driving the long snout into the water with the speed and power of those massive neck muscles. In deeper water during the wet season when the river was full and fish were more widely dispersed, Spinosaurus was probably a more active swimmer, using its paddle-like tail to propel itself through the water in pursuit of prey. The biomechanical analyses that followed the 2014 Ibrahim paper modeled the swimming performance of the reconstructed tail and found that it would have been capable of generating substantial thrust through lateral undulation, in a manner broadly similar to the tail-propelled swimming of modern crocodilians. Spinosaurus was not, by these estimates, a speed swimmer in the manner of a dolphin or a tuna. It was a large, relatively slow-moving animal in the water, using endurance and stealth rather than burst speed. But in the river environment, with its complex of channels and backwaters and the large, relatively slow-moving fish that dominated the aquatic community, speed was probably less important than persistence and reach. The enormous Onchopristis sawfish that was almost certainly a primary prey item for Spinosaurus presented interesting hunting challenges. A mature Onchopristis, 8 or 9 meters long, was itself a formidable animal. Its saw-like rostrum lined with barbed rostral teeth was a potentially dangerous weapon that any predator attempting to take it from above would need to be wary of. But for Spinosaurus, whose own skull was long enough and whose jaws were powerful enough to grip a sawfish behind its rostrum, these dangers could be managed. The interlocking conical teeth of Spinosaurus's jaws, designed for gripping rather than slicing, would have held onto a struggling fish with remarkable effectiveness, and once a grip was established, the enormous body mass of the predator would have prevented escape. The rostral teeth of Onchopristis found in close association with Spinosaurus fossils, a pattern of co-occurrence in the fossil record that is not simply coincidental, provide direct physical evidence for this predator-prey relationship. These are not random associations. They represent the remains of meals, the physical record of the hunting relationship that define the central ecological interaction of the Kem Kem River system. Spinosaurus ate Onchopristis. The fossils tell us so. But Spinosaurus was not eating only Onchopristis. The diet of any large predator is rarely so narrow as to focus on a single prey species, and there is no reason to think Spinosaurus was an exception. The coelacanths, the lungfish, the various ray-finned fish of the river, the turtles that crawled along the river bottom, possibly even the smaller crocodiliform archosaurs, all of these would have been potential prey for an animal as large and as flexible in its hunting strategies as Spinosaurus. The abundant and diverse aquatic prey community of the Kem Kem provided Spinosaurus with a buffet of options, and the behavioral flexibility suggested by its anatomy, capable of wading, swimming, or striking from above depending on conditions, meant it could exploit different prey types in different situations. What the isotopic evidence from Spinosaurus fossils tells us about diet is particularly interesting. Isotopic analysis, the measurement of the ratios of different isotopes of elements like oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen preserved in fossil bone, can reveal information about an animal's diet and habitat use, because different food sources and different environments leave distinctive chemical signatures in the body tissues of the animals that consume them. Oxygen isotope ratios, in particular, can distinguish between animals that spent significant time in freshwater versus those that were primarily terrestrial, because freshwater and terrestrial environments have different characteristic oxygen isotope compositions. The isotopic analyses that have been conducted on Spinosaurus bone consistently show signatures consistent with a semi-aquatic lifestyle. Oxygen isotope ratios that suggest regular exposure to freshwaters more consistent with the lifestyle of a semi-aquatic animal like a crocodilian than with a fully terrestrial predator. This isotopic evidence provides an independent line of support for the anatomical evidence, strengthening the overall case for the semi-aquatic interpretation of Spinosaurus ecology. The same types of isotopic analyses on the teeth and bones of Carcharodontosaurus, the predator of the Kem, but contrasting it with a primary lifestyle. This chemical formation, spinosical signature of animal, with the signature of a terrestrial one, is perhaps the most direct evidence we have for the niche partitioning that allowed these two giant predators to coexist. They were not simply anatomically different. Their bones and teeth carry the chemical record of the genuinely different lives they led. The behavioral ecology of Carcharodontosaurus in the Kem Kem landscape is in some ways more intuitive to imagine than that of the exotic, semi-aquatic Spinosaurus, because Carcharodontosaurus was essentially, at its most basic level of description, a very large terrestrial predator in the general mold of the large theropod dinosaurs that we understand fairly well from other sites and other time periods. But in the general mold should not imply uninteresting or straightforward. Carcharodontosaurus was an extraordinary animal, and its behavioral ecology in the specific context of the Kem Kem ecosystem has its own distinctive character. At 12 or more meters in length, Carcharodontosaurus was a predator that could potentially threaten almost any other terrestrial animal in the landscape. The sauropod dinosaurs, the enormous long-necked plant eaters that were its probable primary prey, were themselves of such massive body size that they were rarely vulnerable to any single predator acting alone. The hunting strategy implied by the anatomy of Carcharodontosaurus, those large, serrated, laterally flattened teeth designed for slashing rather than gripping, combined with a skull that was robust enough to deliver powerful biting forces but not so deep and massive as to suggest the bone-crushing specialization seen in some other large theropods, is one of inflicting rapid, severe wounds rather than immediately incapacitating prey through a single killing bite. Think of the great white shark whose teeth the teeth of Carcharodontosaurus were named for. A great white shark does not typically kill its prey outright with a single bite. It inflicts a massive wound, a wound that causes rapid blood loss and often severe trauma to the musculature and internal organs of the prey, and then it may wait or it may pursue, depending on the prey's response. The prey is debilitated by blood loss and shock and eventually becomes incapable of effective escape. It is a brutal strategy, but it is an effective one, particularly when the prey is large and dangerous enough that a prolonged close contact struggle would put the predator at significant risk. Carcharodontosaurus, hunting large sauropods with its shark-like teeth, was probably employing a broadly analogous strategy. A rapid strike from the side or from behind, targeting vulnerable areas of the prey's anatomy, the flanks, the base of the tail, possibly the neck, would have inflicted wounds of potentially catastrophic severity. The predator might then withdraw from the immediate danger of the prey's defensive responses. A sauropod's tail, swung by the enormous muscles of a panicking multi-ton animal, was a weapon of considerable force and wait for the blood loss to do its work. This interpretation of Carcharodontosaurus's hunting strategy is, of course, inference, but it is inference grounded in the anatomy of the animal and in what we know about the hunting strategies of comparable large predators, both modern and extinct. And it has interesting ecological implications for the Kem Kem ecosystem, because it suggests that Carcharodontosaurus was not simply a killing, relatively sophisticated predator whose success depended on behavioral judgment, on the ability to assess the vulnerability of potential prey, to choose the timing and angle of an attack that maximized damage while minimizing risk to the predator itself. The large brain that Carcharodontosaurus shared with other large theropod dinosaurs, not large by mammalian standards, but substantially larger relative to body size than the brains of crocodilians and other non-dinosaurian reptiles, would have been capable of supporting this kind of behavioral complexity. Large theropod dynamically reflexive killers. They were active, intelligent predators capable of learning, of making behavioral decisions, and of adjusting their strategies in response to the specific circumstances they faced. The relationship between Carcharodontosaurus and Spinosaurus in the Kem Kem ecosystem was almost certainly not one of direct competition in the ecological sense. They were eating different prey in different habitats, as both the anatomical and isotopic evidence suggests, but they would certainly have been aware of each other. In an environment where both species were common, encounters between individuals of these two gigantic predators at the river margins, where the terrestrial hunting grounds of Carcharodontosaurus met the aquatic domain of Spinosaurus, must have occurred with some regularity. What happened during such encounters? This is one of the questions that the fossil record cannot answer with confidence, and it has stimulated considerable popular speculation. The image of Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus in direct combat, two of the largest carnivorous dinosaurs that ever lived, locked in mortal combat at the edge of the ancient river, is undeniably dramatic, but it is also probably ecologically unlikely as a regular occurrence. Large predators in modern ecosystems go to considerable lengths to avoid costly direct confrontations with other large predators of comparable size. The risk of injury in such a confrontation is simply too high. Even a minor wound, in a world without modern medicine, can become infected and fatal, and a major wound from an opponent of comparable size and weaponry could be immediately life-threatening. The more likely pattern, informed by what we know about how modern large predators behave when they encounter each other at shared resources like water sources or prey carcasses, is one of mutual avoidance and threat displays rather than outright combat. A Carcharodontosaurus approaching the river to drink the massive, sail-backed form of a Spinosaurus at the water's edge would probably have assessed the situation and made a behavioral decision, challenge the aquatic giant for the resource, or find another approach route. A Spinosaurus hauled out on the bank to warm itself in the sun, encountering a Carcharodontosaurus patrolling the river margin in search of terrestrial prey, would similarly have needed to assess the situation. These were not mindless animals. They were predators with behavioral intelligence, and behavioral intelligence includes the wisdom to recognize when a confrontation is not worth the risk. The river bank, therefore, was a place of tension as well as abundance, a place where the two great predator guilds of the Kem Kem met and negotiated the boundaries of their respective domains through the behavioral language of posture, display, and strategic withdrawal that large predators in all ecosystems have employed to manage the unavoidable consequences of sharing space. Beyond the great theatrical drama of the giant predators, the Kem Kem ecosystem was, of course, populated by a far greater diversity of smaller and less spectacular animals whose lives were just as ecologically real and just as important to the functioning of the community. The focus on giants, Spinosaurus, Carcharodontosaurus, the enormous fish, is understandable and in many ways justified by the scientific significance of these animals, but it can create a distorted picture of the ecosystem if taken to extremes. The ecological pyramid is wide at the bottom and narrow at the top, and the vast majority of the animals in the Kem Kem were not giants. Among the medium-sized predators of the Kem Kem, one of the most scientifically interesting is a dinosaur called Deltadromeus agilis, a large, lightly built theropod that appears to represent something quite different from the massive, heavily constructed body plan of Carcharodontosaurus. Deltadromeus, whose name means delta runner, was apparently a fast-moving, long-legged predator, anatomically more gracile than its giant co-inhabitant and probably hunting prey of a different size range and character. A predator in the 3 to 8 meter range, depending on which estimates are accepted, Deltadromeus would have been a significant presence in the Kem Kem landscape without being in direct competition with the much larger Carcharodontosaurus for the same large sauropod prey. The ecology of Deltadromeus in the Kem Kem is an interesting case study in predator niche differentiation within the terrestrial component of the ecosystem. If Carcharodontosaurus was the specialist for very large prey, the sauropod hunter, then a faster, more agile predator like Deltadromeus was probably targeting the medium-sized and smaller animals of the landscape. Smaller dinosaurs, juvenile sauropods, large lizards, possibly even some of the medium-sized crocodiliform archosaurs that ventured onto land. All of these would have been potential prey for a predator of Deltadromeus's build and presumed behavioral repertoire. The co-occurrence of multiple theropod predators of different sizes in the same ecosystem is not unusual in the Cretaceous fossil record. It is, in fact, the typical pattern. Different sized predators can coexist because they target different sized prey, and the prey community in any productive ecosystem typically contains a range of prey sizes sufficient to sustain predators across a considerable size range. In the Kem Kem, the terrestrial predator guild almost certainly included multiple species spanning a wide range of sizes, from small, fast-running predators capable of catching lizards and small mammals. And yes, small mammals existed during the Cretaceous, though they were generally modest in size and largely nocturnal, all the way up to Carcharodontosaurus targeting multi-ton sauropods. This diversity of predator sizes mirrored a corresponding diversity of prey sizes in the terrestrial environment, another aspect of the Kem Kem ecosystem that emphasizes its ecological complexity. The ancient river basin was not a simple two-dimensional world of giants. It was a complex, multi-layered community in which animals of every size from insects to multi-ton dinosaurs occupied their particular niches, interacted with each other in specific ways, and together formed the intricate web of ecological relationships that is the hallmark of a mature, well-developed biological community. Among the most ecologically important but least charismatic members of the Kem Kem community were the small and medium-sized animals that fulfilled the crucial middle trophic levels of the food web, the animals that were too small to be apex predators, but too large to be the primary producers or invertebrate consumers at the ecosystem's base. These middle trophic levels are, in many ways, the most important for the functioning of the overall community, because they are the channels through which energy flows from the abundant lower levels to the spectacular but rare upper levels. The small crocodiliform archosaurs of the Kem Kem species in the 1 to 3 meter size range were probably among the most ecologically significant of these middle-level consumers. In the small crocodiliforms would have occupied a role analogous to that of medium-sized predatory fish in modern river systems, efficient hunters of small fish, frogs, invertebrates, and anything else of appropriate size that came within reach. They would have been abundant enough and widespread enough across the various microhabitats of the river system to process enormous quantities of small prey and make that energy available to the larger predators that preyed on them. The diversity of crocodiliform body plans in the Cretaceous is itself worth pausing to appreciate. We have already mentioned Sarcosuchus as a spectacular example of the giant end of the crocodiliform spectrum. But the Cretaceous crocodiliforms also included animals of far more unusual design, species with upright, terrestrial postures and teeth adapted for herbivory, species with highly derived skull shapes adapted for particular prey types, species that were essentially terrestrial predators of small vertebrates using a hunting style that would not have looked particularly crocodilian to a modern observer. This diversity of form reflects the broader ecological opportunity that existed for crocodiliform archosaurs in the Mesozoic before the end Cretaceous extinction, and the subsequent explosive diversification of mammals narrowed the ecological scope of the surviving crocodilians to the essentially similar, primarily aquatic, predatory lifestyle that characterizes all living species. In the Kem Kem, this crocodiliform diversity added ecological complexity to both the aquatic and terrestrial portions of the ecosystem. The aquatic community had its giant Sarcosuchus and its medium-sized generalist crocodiliforms. The terrestrial margins of the river were probably home to smaller, more terrestrially adapted crocodiliform species that spent more time on land than in water. And the deep river channels had their own resident crocodiliform fauna adapted for the faster current and greater depth of the main channel. The turtles of the Kem Kem are another group whose ecological importance should not be underestimated despite their less glamorous reputation. Modern river systems in tropical Africa support remarkable turtle diversities, multiple species of different sizes, with different dietary specializations and different microhabitat preferences, that together process enormous quantities of plant material, invertebrates, and small vertebrates. The ancient Kem Kem would have been similar, with a diverse turtle community filling these broadly omnivorous to herbivorous roles in the aquatic food web. Some Kem Kem turtle species grew to considerable sizes, far larger than most modern freshwater turtles, and would themselves have been significant consumers of plant material and smaller aquatic animals, as well as significant prey items for the giant Spinosaurus and the large crocodiliforms. In the aerial dimension of the ecosystem, the pterosaurs were not the only flying animals. Early birds, small, somewhat primitive-looking by modern standards, but recognizably avian in their general body plan, were present in the broader Cretaceous world and were almost certainly part of the Kem Kem fauna, even if their fragile bones are rarely preserved in the fossil record. These early birds would have occupied the small-scale insectivore and small fish eater niches in the aerial community, catching insects over the water surface, snatching small fish from shallow areas inaccessible to the much larger pterosaurs, nesting in vegetation along the river banks. The insects themselves, the invertebrate fauna of the Kem Kem, are almost entirely invisible in the fossil record from this region, but they were certainly there, and their ecological importance cannot be overstated. Insects are the backbone of most terrestrial and many freshwater ecosystems. They pollinate plants, decompose organic matter, convert plant material into animal biomass, and serve as prey for an enormous diversity of larger animals. The Cretaceous was, by the time of the Kem Kem, already a world with a rich and diverse insect fauna. Flowering plants and insects were in the early stages of their extraordinary co-evolutionary relationship, and the insect diversity of the Cretaceous was already considerable. Every small animal in the Kem Kem ecosystem, the small lizards, the early birds, the small pterosaurs, the juvenile crocodilians, the small fish, depended on insects and other invertebrates as a major food source, and the abundance of these invertebrates was in turn the foundation on which the productivity of the entire higher community rested. The vegetation of the Kem Kem landscape, the plant community that formed the photosynthetic base of the entire terrestrial and nearshore food web, has received less scientific attention than the dramatic vertebrate fauna, but it was of fundamental ecological importance. Without understanding the vegetation, we cannot fully understand the herbivores, and without understanding the herbivores, we cannot fully understand the predators that fed on them. The plant community of the Kem Kem region during the Cenomanian stage of the Cretaceous was a transitional one, existing at a moment in the history of plant life when the ancient dominance of ferns, cycads, and conifers was beginning to be challenged by the explosive diversification of the angiosperms, the flowering plants that would eventually come to dominate most of the world's terrestrial ecosystems. But in the Kem Kem of 100 million years ago, this transition was still very much in progress, and the vegetation had a character quite different from any modern tropical river system. Along the river margins, where moisture was most abundant and most reliable, the vegetation would have been particularly lush. Tree ferns, some of which could reach considerable heights, probably formed a significant component of the river edge vegetation, providing shade over the water and contributing organic matter to the aquatic system when their fronds fell or were washed in by rain. Various conifer species, some of which in the Cretaceous reached enormous sizes comparable to modern giant sequoias, would have grown along the better drained river terraces, their fallen seeds and needles contributing to the riparian litter that fed the invertebrates that fed the fish that fed the giants. Cycads, ancient seed plants with palm-like fronds that have existed essentially unchanged in their general form for hundreds of millions of years, were a significant component of the Cretaceous plant community worldwide, and the Kem Kem landscape was almost certainly no exception. Cycads can grow in a variety of conditions and are notable for the nutritious seeds they produce, which would have been an important food source for small animals and potentially for the larger herbivorous dinosaurs as well. The early angiosperms of the Kem Kem period were probably smaller and less dominant than the later flowers and trees that would eventually reshape the world's vegetation, but they were there, herbaceous plants in the lower vegetation layers, possibly some early flowering shrubs in disturbed or open areas along the river margins. Their flowers, small and primitive by modern standards, were already engaging with the insect fauna in the co-evolutionary relationships that would, over tens of millions of years, produce the extraordinary diversity of flowering plants and their pollinators that characterizes the modern world. The herbivorous dinosaurs of the Kem Kem, primarily the sauropods, would have fed on this vegetation with the extraordinary efficiency that their remarkable anatomy provided. The long neck of a sauropod was not simply a visual spectacle. It was an ecological tool of tremendous power, allowing these enormous animals to feed without moving their bodies across areas of vegetation that would have required significant locomotory effort from a shorter-necked animal. A large sauropod could stand in one place and sweep its neck across a wide arc, consuming vegetation from ground level to considerable height, processing enormous quantities of plant material each day to fuel its massive body. The feeding ecology of sauropods in the Kem Kem would have had significant effects on the vegetation. These were animals large enough to substantially alter the structure of the plant community they fed in. Fallen trees, broken branches, stripped vegetation, all of these physical modifications to the landscape created by sauropod feeding would have created opportunities for other plant species and for the animals that depended on disturbed or open habitats. In modern ecosystems, large herbivores like elephants play a crucial ecosystem engineer role, modifying the structure of the habitat in ways that create ecological opportunities for many other species. The sauropods of the Kem Kem were playing an analogous role on an even larger scale. The seasonal cycle of the Kem Kem ecosystem, the monsoon-driven rhythm of flood and drought that we introduced in Part 1, had different effects on different parts of the community, and understanding these effects in detail adds crucial texture to our picture of life in the ancient river basin. Let us follow one complete annual cycle through the ecosystem, from the beginning of the wet season to the end of the dry, watching how each part of the community responds to the changing conditions. The rains arrive, not gradually, but with the kind of dramatic suddenness that characterizes monsoon onset in tropical systems, a shift from weeks of dry heat to torrential downpours that can dump enormous quantities of water on the landscape in a matter of hours. The rivers, dry or reduced to a trickle during the late dry season, respond almost immediately. Dry channels fill from bank to bank. The main river begins to rise. Water spreads across the floodplain, reaching into depressions and low-lying areas that have been dry for months, creating temporary pools and channels that extend the aquatic habitat far beyond the boundaries of the permanent river. For the fish of the ancient Kem Kem, the onset of the wet season is a signal, perhaps triggered by the change in water temperature, by the change in water chemistry as fresh rainwater mixes with the concentrated dry season water, or by some other environmental cue to begin breeding. The flooded areas of the floodplain, with their shallow, warm, vegetation-rich water and their relative safety from the deep water predators of the main channel, are the breeding habitat for many of the river's fish species. Eggs are laid, juveniles hatch, and the early weeks and months of the wet season see an explosive fish production that will eventually translate into the enormous adult fish populations that define the Kem Kem aquatic community. The explosion of aquatic productivity during the wet season extends beyond the fish. Aquatic invertebrates, insects with aquatic larval stages, crustaceans, freshwater mollusks, also take advantage of the expanded habitat to reproduce in great numbers. The water becomes rich with life at every level, from the microscopic algae and bacteria that form the base of the aquatic food web through the invertebrates to the small fish and eventually the large predators. For Spinosaurus, the wet season is a time of relative abundance but also of relative dispersal. The fish it preys on are spread across a much larger area of flooded habitat, and while they are abundant, they are harder to concentrate and capture than they will be during the dry season. Spinosaurus responds by ranging more widely, moving through the expanded network of channels and flooded areas, using its aquatic locomotion to access habitats that are inaccessible to strictly terrestrial predators, exploiting the breeding aggregations of large fish that predictably form in certain areas of the flooded plain. The wet season also brings benefits to the terrestrial component of the ecosystem. The rain stimulates plant growth across the landscape, producing a flush of fresh vegetation that the herbivorous dinosaurs exploit eagerly. Sauropods that had been concentrated near the permanent river channels during the dry season can now disperse widely across the landscape, following the advancing front of new growth, ranging into areas that were too dry and too barren to support them during the dry months. This dispersal reduces competition among individuals of the same species, and it also temporarily reduces the encounter rate between prey and the large terrestrial predators like Carcharodontosaurus. The wet season is not, therefore, necessarily the time of greatest predation pressure for the terrestrial herbivores. Paradoxically, the abundance and dispersal of the rainy season may actually reduce the probability that any individual herbivore will be found and attacked by a predator, because both prey and predators are spread across a larger area and the density of interactions is reduced. This is a pattern seen in modern systems. The wet season in tropical Africa, when vegetation is lush and herbivores are widely dispersed, can actually be a period of relatively low predation pressure compared to the dry season when prey is concentrated at remaining water sources. The dry season in the Kem Kem begins slowly and accelerates. The rains taper off. The river level begins to drop. The flooded areas of the floodplain drain back into the main channels, and the fish and other aquatic animals that had spread through the floodplain are forced to retreat as the water retreats. The channels narrow, the pools shrink, and as they shrink, the concentration of aquatic life within them increases. For the aquatic predators, this is the time of abundance. Spinosaurus during the dry season had access to prey concentrated by the very landscape it lived in, fish packed into shrinking pools, unable to escape, forced by the retreat of the water into increasingly crowded and accessible refugia. The energy expenditure required to catch prey decreases dramatically during the dry season as prey density increases and escape routes diminish. An individual Spinosaurus that had ranged widely during the wet season now had the option of establishing itself at a productive pool or channel section and essentially waiting for the prey to present itself. The concentration effect of the dry season also created opportunities for the terrestrial predators at the river margins. Herbivorous dinosaurs, forced by the drying of water sources across the landscape to congregate at the remaining river, came within reach of the terrestrial predators that waited for them there. A Carcharodontosaurus that patrolled the river banks during the dry season had access to a predictable concentration of large prey animals, sauropods that needed to drink, that needed to access the water, that could not avoid the river margins however dangerous those margins might be. The river margins during the dry season were, therefore, simultaneously places of intense predation pressure and places of ecological necessity. The prey could not avoid them because the water they needed to survive was there. The predators concentrated there because the prey concentrated there. And the predators of the river, Spinosaurus, the crocodiliforms, competed with the predators of the land, Carcharodontosaurus, Deltadromeus, for the same river margin resources, though exploiting them in fundamentally different ways. This convergence of terrestrial and aquatic predators at the river during the dry season created the ecological equivalent of a crossroads, a place where the different functional communities of the Kem Kem ecosystem met and interacted. Large herbivores came to drink and became vulnerable to both the aquatic ambush predators lurking in the shallows and the terrestrial predators waiting on the bank. Large fish were concentrated in the remaining deep channels and became targets for Spinosaurus. Dead animals of both terrestrial and aquatic types became available as carrion for any predator willing to scavenge, and the pterosaurs overhead were well positioned to take advantage of such opportunities. Everything came together at the river during the dry season, and the ecological intensity of that convergence defined the character of the Kem Kem world perhaps more than any other single feature. The fossil record itself, the physical evidence preserved in the Kem Kem beds, reflects this ecological intensity in ways that are, once you know what to look for, quite striking. The abundance of large predator fossils relative to large herbivore fossils, which we mentioned in Part 1, is partly a function of differential preservation, but may also reflect the genuine ecological reality that predators were unusually abundant in the system relative to their prey, sustained by the extraordinary aquatic productivity of the river in ways that reduced their dependence on terrestrial prey to a degree unusual in Cretaceous ecosystems. The types of fossils preserved in the Kem Kem beds, teeth in particular, tell us something important about the taphonomy of the system, meaning the processes by which organisms became fossils. Teeth are among the hardest and most durable structures in the vertebrate body, and they are shed and replaced continuously throughout the lives of most reptiles and fish. A crocodilian or a large theropod dinosaur shed thousands of teeth over the course of its lifetime, each shed tooth potentially becoming a fossil if conditions were right. The abundance of shed teeth in the Kem Kem sediments reflects both the abundance of tooth-bearing animals in the ecosystem and the continuous shedding of teeth that characterized their biology. The spatial distribution of fossils within the Kem Kem beds, which types of fossils occur together, and in what types of sedimentary context, has been a focus of detailed research by paleontologists attempting to reconstruct the specific depositional environments of the ancient river system, and to use those environmental reconstructions to understand more about where different animals lived and died. Fossils found in channel sandstones, sediments deposited by fast-moving water in the main river channel, represent animals that lived in or were transported through the main channel. Fossils in finer grained mudstones and siltstones, deposited in quieter, lower energy environments, represent animals that lived or died in the quieter backwater and floodplain environments. This kind of taphonomic analysis adds spatial resolution to our reconstruction of the ecosystem, helping us understand not just who was there, but where specifically different animals preferred to live and what parts of the river environment different species favored. Spinosaurus remains associated with channel sediments are consistent with an animal that spent time in the main river channel, an aquatic environment that would have required the swimming capability that its anatomy provided. Terrestrial dinosaur remains found in floodplain sediments are consistent with animals that lived and died away from the main channel, brought to or dying near the river margins in the ways we have discussed. The preservation of fish scales and other non-skeletal elements in some Kem Kem sediments provides additional ecological information. The size distribution of fish scales from different parts of the formation can tell us about the size distribution of fish in different parts of the ancient river system. Were the giant fish equally distributed through all habitats, or were there smaller fish in shallower and calmer areas with the giants concentrated in the deep channels? The preliminary answers from the available evidence suggest the latter, a pattern entirely consistent with what we would expect from modern river systems and from the ecological logic of the ancient Kem Kem. The bone surfaces of some Kem Kem specimens preserve evidence of the ecological interactions they experienced in life. Bite marks on bones, identified by their characteristic size, spacing, and cross-sectional shape, can be attributed to the specific predators that inflicted them, and they provide direct physical evidence of predator-prey interactions and even inter-predator interactions, when one large predator scavenges the kill of another, leaving its own bite marks on bones that already bear the marks of the original killer. The careful documentation and analysis of bite marks on Kem Kem specimens is an active area of research that has the potential to reveal specific predator-prey relationships with a directness that no other line of evidence can match. The physical landscape of the Kem Kem, the specific topography, geology, and hydrology of the ancient river basin is reconstructed from the sedimentological evidence preserved in the rock sequence itself. The kinds of sediment, their grain size, their internal structure, the way they relate to each other vertically and laterally, all of these features of the rock record are read by sedimentologists as evidence about the nature of the ancient depositional environment. The Kem Kem beds represent, in sedimentological terms, the deposits of a large, meandering to braided river system with associated floodplain and delta environments. The coarser sandstones represent channel deposits, sediment moved and deposited by the flowing water of the main river. The finer mudstones and siltstones represent overbank deposits, material that was carried out of the main channel during floods and deposited on the surrounding floodplain as floodwaters spread laterally and slowed. The organization of these different sediment types into repeated vertical sequences tells us about the migration of river channels across the floodplain over time, as channels shifted, cut new paths, and abandoned old ones in the way that large, dynamic river systems consistently do. Channel migration and the destruction of old habitats as channels shifted away created a constantly changing mosaic of ecological conditions that different species responded to in different ways. Pioneer species colonized newly created habitats quickly. More established communities developed in areas of stable habitat. And as channels shifted and stability was disrupted, the whole cycle began again. The direction of flow in the ancient Kem Kem River has been reconstructed from sedimentological evidence, specifically from the orientation of current ripple marks and cross-bedding structures preserved in the channel sandstones. The evidence suggests a general flow direction from southeast to northwest, meaning the river ran from the interior of the ancient African continent toward what was then a seaway separating Africa from the European and North American landmasses. The river was, in its broader hydrological context, a tributary system contributing water and sediment to a coastal delta environment where fresh water met the ancient sea. This coastal connection is important because it means that the Kem Kem River system was not isolated. It was connected at its downstream end to marine environments that would have allowed some degree of exchange of animals between freshwater and marine habitats. Some of the fish species of the Kem Kem may have been euryhaline, capable of tolerating a range of salinities, and could have moved between the freshwater river and the brackish or marine coastal environments at the river's mouth. Some of the aquatic predators, perhaps including large crocodiliforms, may similarly have used both freshwater and coastal marine environments at different times or at different life stages. This connectivity between the ancient river system and the sea also makes the eventual fate of the Kem Kem ecosystem, the drowning of the river basin by rising sea levels, more comprehensible. The connection between the river and the sea was not simply a physical junction at the river mouth. It was a dynamic interface that responded to changes in sea level, and in the Middle Cretaceous, sea levels were changing dramatically. We come now to one of the most consequential and scientifically significant events in the history of the Kem Kem ecosystem, the event that ended it. The Cenomanian-Turonian boundary event, named for the two stages of the Cretaceous period that it marks the transition between, was one of the most dramatic oceanographic and environmental events of the entire Cretaceous period. It occurred approximately 93 to 94 million years ago, roughly 6 to 7 million years after the time of the Kem Kem's greatest diversity and productivity, and it had effects that were felt across the entire globe. The fundamental driver of the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary event was a massive pulse of volcanic activity, primarily from what are called large igneous provinces, enormous outpourings of lava from the Earth's mantle that covered vast areas of the ocean floor with new basaltic rock. This volcanic activity had multiple cascading effects on the Earth's climate and oceanography. The outgassing of enormous quantities of carbon dioxide warmed the planet's climate, which was already warm by modern standards, to even higher temperatures. The warming of the oceans reduced the solubility of oxygen in seawater, leading to conditions of widespread oceanic anoxia, the depletion of oxygen from large volumes of ocean water. Oceanic anoxia had profound consequences for marine ecosystems. Large volumes of the world's ocean became inhospitable to most forms of marine life, triggering marine extinctions and dramatically altering the ecological character of ocean communities. The geological record of this event is preserved as what geologists call an oceanic anoxic event, specifically Oceanic Anoxic Event 2, or OAE2, a characteristic layer of black, organic-rich shale that was deposited on ocean floors around the world during the period when oxygen-depleted conditions prevailed. But the effects of OAE2 were not confined to the oceans. The associated global warming contributed to a dramatic rise in sea levels, eustatic sea level rise driven by the thermal expansion of ocean water, and by changes in the volume of ocean basins associated with the volcanic activity. Sea levels during OAE2 rose to some of the highest levels of the entire Mesozoic era, levels that would have inundated coastal and low-lying areas on a global scale, converting what had been terrestrial and freshwater environments into shallow marine seas. For the Kem Kem River system, the combination of rising sea levels and the configuration of the ancient African coastline was catastrophic. The river basin, which drained toward the northwest into an already existing shallow seaway between Africa and the northern continents, found itself increasingly encroached upon as sea levels rose and the seaway expanded southward. What had been the river's coastal delta gradually became a shallow marine environment. The saltwater front moved progressively further upstream into what had been the freshwater portion of the river. The transition from a freshwater river system to a marine or brackish coastal environment moved inland, year by year, millennium by millennium, as the sea continued to rise. The animals of the Kem Kem were trapped by this gradual but inexorable environmental transformation. The fish species of the river, the giant Onchopristis, the coelacanths, the lungfish, were freshwater or freshwater-tolerant animals. As salt water intruded progressively further into their habitat, they faced conditions outside their physiological tolerance. Some may have retreated upstream as the salt front advanced, compressing their available habitat into a progressively smaller area. Others may have died out locally as conditions deteriorated beyond what they could tolerate. For Spinosaurus, whose entire ecological strategy was built around the exploitation of the river's giant fish community, the degradation of that fish community was existential. An animal so specifically adapted for aquatic predation in the freshwater river environment had nowhere to go when the river itself was transformed. It could not simply shift to hunting terrestrial prey. Its anatomy, so exquisitely suited for aquatic life, was poorly designed for the fast, efficient terrestrial hunting that would have been required to make a living as a land predator. It could not follow the fish into the sea. A freshwater river system predator had no adaptations for marine life. The disappearance of Spinosaurus from the fossil record at or near the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary is not a sudden extinction in the manner of the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs 66 million years later. It was a gradual regional disappearance, the consequence of habitat loss driven by environmental change. As the river shrank and the sea advanced, the population of Spinosaurus in the region declined. Individuals that failed to find sufficient food became weakened and died without reproducing. Populations fragmented as the river system broke into isolated segments. The remarkable animal that had dominated the ancient river for millions of years, the giant, sail-backed, semi-aquatic predator that was unlike any other dinosaur in the world, dwindled and was gone. The same fate on the same timescale and for the same fundamental reasons befell the other specialist species of the ancient Kem Kem. The giant sawfish Onchopristis disappeared. The extraordinary diversity of the river's crocodiliform community was reduced as freshwater habitat was lost. The sauropod dinosaurs that had browsed the riverside vegetation found their habitat transformed as the river margins were converted first to brackish marshes, and then to tidal flats and eventually to shallow sea bottom. What replaced the Kem Kem ecosystem was, from a geological perspective, a shallow marine sea, a warm, productive ocean environment with its own characteristic fauna of marine reptiles, fish, invertebrates, and eventually the chalky remains of microscopic marine organisms that would eventually compact into the limestone deposits that overlie the Kem Kem beds in parts of the region. It was a different world, no less interesting in its own way, no less productive or ecologically complex. But it was utterly unlike what had gone before, and the specialized giants of the ancient river had no place in it. The transformation from river to sea was not completed in a human lifetime, or even in 1,000 human lifetimes. It played out over millions of years of geological time, a gradual, irreversible process that operated on timescales so vast that no individual animal, no population, no species could perceive it or respond to it as an event. It was simply the changing of the world, the slow, continuous process of geological and climatological change that has repeatedly and profoundly altered the habitats available to life on Earth throughout the planet's long history. The Kem Kem was not the first great ecosystem to be lost to environmental change, and it would not be the last. The loss of the Kem Kem ecosystem, viewed from the perspective of deep geological time, is both a tragedy and a natural inevitability. Ecosystems come and go, the conditions that sustain them change. The species that are perfectly adapted to one set of conditions may be wholly unable to adapt to a different set. This is the fundamental dynamic of evolution and extinction, the endless cycle of origination and disappearance that has characterized life on Earth since its very beginnings. But the Kem Kem's disappearance is also a reminder of something important, that ecological communities of extraordinary complexity and productivity can be fundamentally dependent on specific environmental conditions that may prove transient on geological timescales. The ancient river system worked because of a very particular combination of factors: the warm Cretaceous climate, the specific geographic configuration of the ancient African continent, the monsoon-driven seasonal hydrology, the evolutionary history that had produced the particular fish and reptile communities of the region. Remove any one of these factors, or, as happened at the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary, change the fundamental nature of the environment through rising sea levels, and the entire extraordinary edifice can collapse. The lesson is not necessarily transferable directly to any particular contemporary situation. The Kem Kem was a unique place in a unique time, and its ecology had no precise modern analog. But the general principle that extraordinarily productive and diverse ecosystems can be built on specific environmental foundations that are vulnerable to change is one that resonates across many contexts and many timescales. The scientists who study the Kem Kem are aware of this dimension of their work, the way in which understanding the conditions that made the ancient ecosystem possible and the changes that destroyed it speaks to broader questions about the relationship between environmental conditions and biological communities. These are not abstract questions. They are questions with deep roots in our understanding of how life works on this planet, and the Kem Kem provides one of the most dramatic and detailed case studies available for their exploration. The science of the Kem Kem is not finished, far from it. In the years since the landmark 2014 Spinosaurus paper by Ibrahim and colleagues, the scientific investigation of this extraordinary fossil locality has intensified and broadened in ways that continue to produce significant new discoveries and significant revisions to our understanding of the ecosystem and its inhabitants. new species continue to be described from the Kem Kem beds. The diversity of the fauna, already remarkable as documented, almost certainly does not represent the full complement of species that inhabited the ancient ecosystem. The fragmentary nature of the fossil record means that many species are probably still unrepresented in the known fossil assemblage. There remains too fragmentary to be recognized or not yet discovered. Each new expedition to the region, each new batch of material worked on by researchers, has the potential to add new species to the inventory, or to provide new information about species already known that dramatically changes our understanding of their anatomy, their ecology, or their evolutionary relationships. The refinement of our understanding of Spinosaurus itself continues actively. Subsequent discoveries of additional Spinosaurus, including, importantly, additional tail vertebrae that confirmed and extended the reconstruction of the paddle-like tail, have progressively strengthened and refined the 2014 reconstruction. Biomechanical modeling of how Spinosaurus moved in water, how it generated thrust with its tail, what swimming speeds it could achieve, and how it would have navigated the specific character of the ancient Kem Kem River, fast channels, quiet backwaters, shallow flooded areas, has become increasingly sophisticated. Three-dimensional models of the complete animal have been developed, tested against the physical evidence of the fossils, and used to make increasingly precise predictions about the animal's behavioral capabilities. The question of how Spinosaurus moved on land, whether it was capable of any effective terrestrial locomotion, and if so what that locomotion looked like, has been one of the more actively debated aspects of the post-2014 Spinosaurus research. Some researchers, taking the most extreme interpretation of the aquatic adaptation evidence, have argued that Spinosaurus was essentially unable to move effectively on land and spent virtually its entire life in the water. Others have argued for a more intermediate position, an animal that was highly effective in the water but that could and did move on land for specific purposes such as accessing basking sites, moving between water bodies during dry periods, or reaching terrestrial prey when the opportunity arose. The resolution of this debate has important implications for our understanding of Spinosaurus's ecology and its relationship to the other predators of the Kem Kem. An animal that was essentially confined to the water would have had very little ecological interaction with the terrestrial predators like Carcharodontosaurus. They would have occupied entirely separate ecological spaces with minimal overlap. An animal capable of effective terrestrial movement would have had occasional access to terrestrial prey and occasional encounters with terrestrial predators, creating a more complex pattern of ecological interaction. The current scientific consensus leans toward an intermediate position. Spinosaurus was highly specialized for aquatic life, but retained some capacity for terrestrial movement, perhaps analogous in broad terms to the terrestrial capabilities of modern large crocodilians, which can and do move on land but are clearly most capable and most at home in the water. The short, dense hindlimbs of Spinosaurus would have made rapid terrestrial locomotion difficult and energetically expensive, but slow movement on land, perhaps in a quadrupedal or semi-quadrupedal posture that used the robust forelimbs as well as the hindlimbs for support, would have been feasible. The ongoing debate about Spinosaurus's terrestrial capabilities illustrates a broader methodological challenge in paleontology, the difficulty of moving from fossil anatomy, which is a static record of the form of an animal at the moment of preservation, to behavior which is dynamic and leaves no direct fossil record. We can measure the bones, we can model the mechanics, we can compare to modern analogs, but we cannot observe a living Spinosaurus to verify our inferences. We are always ultimately making our best supported guess, and the quality of that guess improves as we gather more evidence and develop better analytical tools, but it never becomes certainty. This epistemological humility is not a weakness of paleontological science, it is its strength. The acknowledgement that our current understanding is the best available interpretation of the available evidence, rather than a final and definitive truth, is what keeps the science moving forward, open to revision in the light of new discoveries, responsive to the evidence rather than committed to a particular narrative regardless of what the evidence says. The broader scientific significance of the Kem Kem ecosystem extends well beyond the remarkable individual species it contained. The Kem Kem represents a unique window into the ecology of a Cretaceous African river system at the peak of the age of dinosaurs, a window that has no real equivalent in the fossil record of other regions. Understanding this ecosystem contributes to our broader understanding of Cretaceous ecology worldwide, providing data points for comparative studies of how ecosystems were organized, how energy flowed through food webs, how predator and prey communities were structured, and how major environmental events like the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary affected biological communities. The Kem Kem also illuminates an aspect of Cretaceous biogeography, the geographic distribution of species and the exchange of faunas between different parts of the world that has significant implications for our understanding of evolutionary history. The specific combination of animals found in the Kem Kem, carcharodontosaurid theropods, rebachosaurid sauropods, various groups of fish and reptiles, has parallels in roughly contemporaneous deposits from South America, reflecting the biological connections that existed between Africa and South America during this period and the pathways by which species moved between these continents before they were fully separated by the widening Atlantic Ocean. These biogeographic connections, the evidence of species exchange between continents that were in the process of separating, are one of the most scientifically valuable aspects of the Kem Kem fauna. They help us trace the evolutionary histories of major groups of animals across the fragmentation of the ancient southern supercontinent Gondwana, and they provide crucial data for the calibration of the molecular clocks used to estimate the timing of evolutionary divergences among living groups of animals. The paleoclimatic significance of the Kem Kem is also considerable. The sedimentological and geochemical record of the Kem Kem beds provides information about past climate conditions, rainfall, temperature, seasonality in North Africa during the Cenomanian stage. This record contributes to our broader understanding of Cretaceous climate, which was itself fundamentally different from modern climate in ways that remain incompletely understood. The warm greenhouse earth of the Cretaceous represents a natural laboratory for studying how the climate system behaves under conditions of elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide, conditions that, through very different mechanisms and on very different timescales, have some relevance to our understanding of potential future climate change. The scientists who study the Kem Kem are therefore engaged not just in the intellectually satisfying but potentially narrow project of reconstructing a specific ancient ecosystem. They are contributing to a much broader scientific enterprise, the effort to understand how the Earth's climate and biological systems have operated across geological time, and what that understanding can tell us about the general principles governing the relationship between the physical environment and life. The human story of the Kem Kem, the story of the people who have discovered, studied, and sometimes lost the fossils of this remarkable place, is itself a story of extraordinary commitment and remarkable perseverance. We have met Ernst Stromer, the German nobleman scientist whose life's work in North Africa was partly destroyed by the Second World War, and Nizar Ibrahim, whose personal connection to the region drove him to fundamental scientific breakthroughs. But the human story of the Kem Kem is populated by many more individuals, researchers from multiple countries, local people with generations of knowledge about the escarpment and its fossils, museum curators and preparators who spent countless hours carefully exposing delicate bone from the surrounding rock, students and postdoctoral researchers who contributed essential pieces of the scientific picture as part of their own developing careers. The international character of Kem Kem science, with significant contributions from researchers in Morocco, Algeria, France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, Canada, and many other countries, reflects both the global significance of the fossil site and the collaborative nature of modern science. No single researcher or research group can possibly possess all the expertise needed to fully investigate a fossil locality as complex and as scientifically rich as the Kem Kem. The geology, the sedimentology, the paleobotany, the invertebrate paleontology, the vertebrate paleontology of multiple groups, the geochemistry, the biomechanics, the paleoclimatology, each of these requires different training and different methods, and the most productive science emerges from collaborations that bring together specialists from all of these fields. The logistical challenges of working in the Kem Kem region are themselves significant. The escarpment is in a remote area, accessible from major cities, but requiring substantial travel across desert terrain to reach the most productive localities. The climate is extreme, hot and dry for much of the year, with the added challenge that the season when weather conditions are most favorable for field work may not coincide with the season when freshly eroded fossil material is most likely to be exposed. Equipment, food, water, and personnel all need to be transported to field camps far from any urban infrastructure. Medical emergencies in such remote locations require careful planning and rapid response capability. Despite these challenges, fieldwork in the Kem Kem continues regularly, driven by the recognition that each field season has the potential to produce significant new material. The combination of ongoing natural erosion, which continuously exposes new fossil material at the surface, and the increasing sophistication of survey methods, including aerial and satellite surveys that can identify promising outcrops from above, means that the discovery of new Kem Kem fossils is not simply a matter of luck, but of systematic, well-planned field effort backed by the best available technology. The preparation of fossils recovered from the Kem Kem, the painstaking work of removing the surrounding rock matrix from the fossil bone, is done both in the field and in laboratory settings, using a combination of mechanical tools, air scribes, small chisels, dental picks, and chemical methods where appropriate. This work requires extraordinary patience, skill, and knowledge. A preparator working on a Kem Kem specimen must know enough anatomy to recognize what they are revealing, must have the manual dexterity to work at the millimeter scale without damaging the fossil surface, and must make informed decisions at every step about how to proceed. The hours invested in fossil preparation for a single significant specimen can run to the thousands, and the best preparators are recognized within the paleontological community as making contributions to the science that are every bit as important as those of the researchers who interpret the prepared specimens. The public engagement dimension of Kem Kem science, the communication of this extraordinary ancient world to audiences beyond the specialist scientific community, is something that the researchers involved in this work have embraced with enthusiasm and, in some cases, remarkable creativity. The story of the Kem Kem, with its giant predators, its dramatic fossil history, and its compelling ecological narrative, is one that speaks powerfully to general audiences, and the scientists involved in its study have made significant efforts to ensure that the broader public has access to what is being discovered. Museum exhibitions featuring Kem Kem fossils, both original specimens and high-quality casts, have brought the ancient world of the river to audiences in multiple countries. The detailed skeletal reconstructions developed as part of the scientific research process have been made into life-sized mounts that give visitors a visceral sense of the scale of these extraordinary animals. Digital reconstructions, computer-generated imagery of the kind used in this documentary, have allowed the ancient ecosystem to be visualized in ways that no static museum mount can achieve, showing the animals moving, hunting, interacting with their environment and with each other. Popular books, articles, and documentary productions have brought the Kem Kem to an audience of millions worldwide. The 2014 Spinosaurus paper alone generated media coverage in dozens of countries and in many languages, a testament to the universal appeal of this particular story. The image of a giant, sail-backed dinosaur swimming through an ancient African river, hunting fish the size of automobiles, is one that captures the imagination regardless of cultural background or prior knowledge of paleontology. Social media has become an increasingly important channel for communicating the ongoing science of the Kem Kem to interested non-specialist audiences. Researchers who were trained in an era when scientific communication meant publishing in academic journals are learning to engage with Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and other platforms to share not just their results but the process of their science. The fieldwork, the laboratory analysis, the debates and revisions and moments of discovery that constitute the day-to-day reality of paleontological research. This transparency, showing the science in progress rather than only presenting polished final conclusions, has the valuable effect of communicating what science actually is, as opposed to the simplified and sometimes distorted picture that can emerge from coverage focused only on dramatic announcements. As we approach the end of this journey through the lost world of the Kem Kem, it is worth stepping back from the specific details, the anatomy of Spinosaurus, the sedimentology of the ancient river, the mechanism of the Cenomanian-Turonian boundary event, and reflecting on what this ancient ecosystem means in a broader sense. What does the Kem Kem tell us, ultimately, about life on this planet? Perhaps most fundamentally, it tells us about the extraordinary range of possibilities that evolution can explore given sufficient time and the right environmental conditions. Spinosaurus, a giant, semi-aquatic, sail-backed dinosaur that swam through an ancient river hunting enormous fish, is not an animal that any reasonable person would have predicted from first principles. It is an animal that natural selection produced through millions of years of gradual refinement, each generation slightly better adapted to the particular conditions of the ancient river than the last, until the result was a creature so specifically designed for its particular ecological role that it had no real analog before or since. The same is true, at a less dramatic level, of every species in the Kem Kem community. Carcharodontosaurus's shark-like teeth were not a feature of general-purpose predators. They were a specific solution to the specific challenge of hunting very large prey in the specific ecological context of the Kem Kem terrestrial environment. Onchopristis's enormous rostrum lined with barbed rostral teeth was a specific solution to the challenge of catching fish in a turbid, fast-moving river. The broad feet and dense bones of Spinosaurus were specific solutions to the challenge of moving efficiently in shallow water and maintaining neutral buoyancy in deeper water. Every anatomical feature of every Kem Kem species is a solution, sometimes elegant, sometimes apparently improbable, to the challenge of making a living in a specific environment. This is what evolution does. Given time, it produces solutions that no designer working from first principles would arrive at, because natural selection operates not from a blueprint, but from the raw material of variation and the filter of survival and reproduction. The solutions it arrives at are constrained by what was available to work with, the anatomy of the ancestral population, the mutation rate, the generation time, the intensity of selection, and they are frequently improbable in their specific form even when they are perfectly logical in their general function. The Kem Kem teaches us also about the fundamental importance of environmental context for ecological communities. The ancient river ecosystem worked because of its specific environmental setting, the warm Cretaceous climate, the monsoon hydrology, the geographic configuration of ancient Africa. Take away any of these conditions, and the community could not have existed in the form it did. The ecological community was, in a profound sense, a product of its environment as much as it was a product of the evolutionary histories of its component species. This environmental dependency, the fact that ecological communities are not freestanding entities, but are always embedded in and sustained by their physical and climatic context, is a principle of the deepest importance. It means that when physical and climatic conditions change, ecological communities must change with them. Species that can adapt to new conditions through behavioral flexibility or evolutionary change may persist through environmental transitions. Species that are too specifically adapted to the conditions that are disappearing, species like Spinosaurus, whose every anatomical feature was calibrated to the specific character of the ancient river, may not. The Kem Kem reminds us that extinction is not always the result of sudden catastrophe. The end Cretaceous asteroid impact, 66 million years after the Kem Kem, was a sudden catastrophe, a rapid environmental change so severe that 3/4 of all species on Earth disappeared in a geologically brief interval. But the disappearance of the Kem Kem ecosystem was different. It was a slow process driven by the gradual rise of sea levels over millions of years, giving species time to retreat, to decline, to dwindle, but not ultimately to adapt to the fundamentally transformed environment that replaced their ancient world. Both kinds of extinction, sudden, catastrophic, and gradual habitat-driven, are real parts of the history of life on Earth. Both have shaped the biological communities of the present world by eliminating lineages that had thrived for millions of years and creating opportunities for the survivors to diversify into vacated ecological roles. The Kem Kem's slow extinction by environmental transformation is a reminder that the gradual, long-term kind of change can be just as consequential for life as the most dramatic and violent of catastrophes. The Kem Kem escarpment today is a landscape of dramatic geological beauty, a series of sandstone cliffs and badlands terrain in the border region of Morocco and Algeria, baking in the North African sun, scoured by the wind, yielding its ancient secrets slowly and incompletely to the scientists and fossil hunters who comb its surface. There is no river there now. The land is dry, harsh, barely habitable even for the most drought-tolerant of modern organisms. The contrast between the ancient richness of the Cretaceous River and the contemporary aridity of the fossil site could not be more stark. And yet, in the rocks, the river is still there. In the sandstones deposited by the ancient current, in the fossils of fish and dinosaurs and crocodilians pressed into the stone, in the chemical signatures preserved in ancient bone, the ancient world persists. Not as a living reality that is gone, as completely and irrevocably as anything can be gone, but as information. as data, as the raw material for scientific reconstruction. The scientists who work in this landscape know this. They walk across terrain that was once the bottom of an ancient river, picking up teeth that fell from the mouths of creatures that have been dead for 100 million years, looking at rock surfaces that were once the mud and sand of a river bank where giants walked. There is something profound about this, the direct physical connection between the modern researcher and the ancient world, mediated by nothing but time and stone. Nizar Ibrahim, speaking about his work in the Kem Kem, has described the sense of personal connection he feels to the ancient river, the feeling that in studying its fossils, he is in some sense reaching back through incomprehensible depths of time to touch a world that, for all its alien character, was as real and as vivid as the world we inhabit today. Every species in the Kem Kem community was real. Every individual animal, every Spinosaurus that stalked the ancient river, every Carcharodontosaurus that ranged across the ancient floodplain, every Onchopristis that cruised the warm brown water was a living creature with its own life history, its own individual experiences of success and failure, predation and escape, hunger and satiation, the whole drama of biological existence. We know almost none of the specific details of any individual's life. The fossils give us anatomy, not biography, but the anatomical evidence allows us to reconstruct the ecological context, the world those individuals moved through, the challenges they faced, the resources they competed for, the community of which they were part. And from that ecological context, we can build a picture of the ancient Kem Kem that, while always incomplete and always subject to revision, is genuinely informative, genuinely illuminating, genuinely wonderful. That wonder, the sense of astonishment at the sheer improbable reality of the ancient river and its giants, is perhaps the most important thing that the science of the Kem Kem can communicate. Not the technical details of bone density or isotope ratios or sedimentary facies, though those details are the foundation on which the science rests. Not the names and anatomical descriptions of the species, though those are the vocabulary in which the story is told. But the wonder itself, the recognition that 100 million years ago on this earth, in the land that would one day become North Africa, there was a river. And in that river and along its banks and in the sky above it, there were giants of a kind that the modern world has never seen and will never see again. Real, alive, extraordinary. The Kem Kem is gone, the giants are gone. But the record of their existence is here, in the rock, and the science that reads that record is alive and growing and finding new things to tell us every year. The lost world of the Kem Kem is being found again, slowly, painstakingly, one fossil at a time, by dedicated scientists who understand that in those fragments of ancient bone and tooth lie some of the most remarkable stories that this planet's long and extraordinary history has to offer. 100 million years of silence. And now, finally, the river speaks again. What remains after we have traced the arc of the Kem Kem story from its origins to its ending, from its scientific discovery to its ongoing investigation, is a question about what we take away from it. What does the ancient river, with its giants and its extraordinary ecological complexity, mean to us, not as scientists or as students of paleontology, but simply as people living on the same planet where all of this once happened? There is something humbling about the Kem Kem, something that puts our own moment in time in perspective. 100 million years is a span of time so vast that human history, all of it, from the first scratch paintings on cave walls to the present moment, is a rounding error, an afterthought, a single tick of a clock that has been running since before the first fish swam in the ancient river. The Kem Kem ecosystem existed, thrived, and ended millions of years before our species appeared. Its giants lived and died and left their bones in the rock without any awareness that their story would one day be of interest to creatures who had not yet evolved. And yet here we are, thinking about them, reconstructing their world, learning from their example. There is something remarkable in that, the fact that the same cognitive capabilities that make us such an unusual and consequential species also allow us to reach back through inconceivable depths of time and recover the stories of creatures that lived in a world we can barely imagine. The Kem Kem also reminds us, if we need reminding, that the world is vastly older and vastly stranger than the familiar environments we move through every day. The modern African savanna, the Amazon rainforest, the coral reef, these are extraordinary places, rich with life and ecological complexity. But they are the current chapter in a story that has been running for billions of years, and the chapters that came before were, in some respects, even more extraordinary than what we see today. The giants of the Kem Kem had no successors of comparable scale. The ecosystem they inhabited, with its semi-aquatic predatory dinosaur, its shark-sized fish, its multiple coexisting giant predators, was genuinely unique in the history of life. It arose from a specific and unrepeatable confluence of evolutionary history and environmental conditions. It flourished for millions of years in its unique form, and when the conditions that sustained it changed, it was gone forever. There will be no new Spinosaurus. The evolutionary lineage that produced it was cut off 66 million years ago by the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs entirely. The ecological niche it occupied, the giant semi-aquatic fish-eating predator of African river systems, has never been filled in the same way since. The modern world has crocodilians and large predatory fish and various semi-aquatic hunters, but nothing that combines all the features of Spinosaurus into an animal of Spinosaurus's extraordinary scale. The Kem Kem was a one-time event, a unique experiment in the laboratory of deep time, and its results are available to us only through the fossils and the science that reads them. That uniqueness is part of what makes it precious. Not precious in a sentimental or romantic sense, but precious in the sense that unique things, irreplaceable things, deserve the fullest possible understanding that we can bring to them. The fossils of the Kem Kem are not renewable resources. Each specimen once removed from the rock is the only specimen it will ever be. If it is lost, as the Stromer specimens were lost in Munich in 1944, the information it contained is lost with it irretrievably. If it is properly preserved and studied, it contributes permanently to our understanding of the ancient world, a contribution that will remain available to scientists and to the public for as long as civilization persists. The care that goes into the study and preservation of Kem Kem fossils, and of fossils everywhere, is, in this light, not merely an academic concern. It is the stewardship of irreplaceable knowledge, the maintenance of our connection to a past that otherwise would be entirely silent and entirely inaccessible. The paleontologists who do this work are, in a very real sense, keepers of the Earth's memory, curators of the record that nature has kept of its own history, reading that record and communicating its contents to the rest of us. The ancient river of the Kem Kem ran for millions of years through a world we will never see. Its waters carried sediment and fish and the shadows of swimming giants. Its banks were walked by predators of a scale and variety that the modern world cannot match. Its seasonal rhythms define the lives of every creature in the community, from the microscopic algae that fed the invertebrates that fed the fish that fed the giants, all the way up to the sail-backed titan that was the river's supreme predator. And then the sea rose. Slowly, over millions of years, the salt water moved upstream. The freshwater community retreated, shrank, fragmented, and finally disappeared. The great river became a shallow sea. The giants of the ancient world were gone, but the record remained, pressed into stone, carried forward through 100 million years of geological time, waiting for the day when a species curious enough and capable enough to read it would emerge and come searching. We are that species. This is our time. And the lost world of the Kem Kem is, improbably and wonderfully, speaking to us across the immensity of geological time. Listen carefully. It has extraordinary things to say. There are places on this earth where time has been buried so completely, so thoroughly sealed beneath stone and sand, that the world they once held seems almost impossible to imagine. Places where the ground beneath your feet is not just rock, it is memory. Compressed, fossilized, ancient memory stretching back so far that the very concept of human history becomes laughably small by comparison. 100 million years, say that number slowly, let it settle. 100 million years ago, while the continents were still finding their shapes, while the oceans were drawing new coastlines across a world we would not recognize, there existed in what is now the scorched and windswept badlands of North Africa a place of almost incomprehensible abundance. A river system so vast, so teeming with life, so dominated by creatures of terrifying scale and power, that modern science is only now beginning to piece together just how extraordinary it truly was. This is the story of the Kem Kem, an ancient river system that once carved its way through the heart of a Cretaceous world, fed by monsoon rains, sheltered beneath a sky that had never seen a human eye, and populated by an assemblage of predators so dense, so diverse, and so enormous that by every rule of modern ecology, the system should not have worked. And yet it did. For millions of years it thrived. Giants moved through its waters and stalked its banks. The air above its surface trembled with the wing beats of creatures that dwarfed any living bird. The river itself pulsed with fish the size of automobiles, armored and ancient, cruising through warm brown water beneath a canopy of prehistoric vegetation. And then slowly, inevitably, it ended. The seas rose, the land changed, the river was swallowed by a shallow inland ocean, and the animals that had evolved so precisely for this one remarkable place disappeared with it, leaving behind only fragments. Teeth. Bones, scales pressed into stone. Scattered clues for scientists to find millions of years later, scattered across a landscape that bears almost no resemblance to the paradise it once was. When giants ruled the river, the lost world of the Kem Kem is the story of that vanished world. It is a story of science and discovery, of fossils lost and found and lost again, of researchers who dedicated their lives to understanding creatures that no human being has ever seen alive. It is a story of an ecosystem so alien and yet so logical that studying it forces us to rethink everything we believe about how nature balances itself, how predators coexist, how life finds a way to fill every possible space available to it. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now let us go back 100 million years back to the river, to the giants. To the lost world of the Kem Kem. To understand the Kem Kem, you first have to understand that the world of 100 million years ago was not simply the modern world with different animals walking across it. It was a fundamentally different planet. The continents, those massive, slow-moving rafts of rock that we take for granted as permanent features of the Earth's surface, were arranged in configurations so different from today that a map of the Cretaceous world would look like something from a fantasy novel rather than a geography textbook. Africa existed, broadly speaking, approaching its current position, connected to other landmasses dramatically shaped how the ecosystems were. The Cretaceous period itself, spanning roughly from 5 million years ago to years ago, biologically predictably unusual periods on Earth. It was significant today. There were caps of any. Sea levels were dramatically now, so high in fact that vast shallow seas covered portions of what we now think of as continental interiors. The atmosphere held more carbon dioxide effect was more, and as a particularly plant life was extraordinarily lush, extensive, and diverse in ways that supported animal communities of staggering complexity and scale. Flowering plants that now dominate terrestrial ecosystem to diversified. The landscapes are still heavily defined by older plant groups, ferns, cycads, conifers, and horsetails, creating a visual texture quite unlike anything you would encounter in a modern forest. Imagine walking through a world where the undergrowth is thick with ferns that grow chest-high, where towering conifers form the canopy above you, where the edges of rivers are lined not with the willows and cottonwoods we might expect, but with strange, ancient plant forms that have no direct equivalent in today's world. It was green, certainly, rich with life, unquestionably, but different in texture, in smell, in sound, in every sensory quality that we use to understand the natural world around us. In this world, in the region that would eventually become the border zone between what is now Morocco and Algeria, the climate and geography conspired to create something remarkable. A great river system, not a single channel but an entire network of waterways, wetlands, floodplains, and seasonal pools, stretched across a landscape that received abundant seasonal rainfall. This was not a dry, desert-like environment. This was a wet, dynamic, seasonally flooded river basin that in its character and ecology bore some resemblance to the great tropical river systems that still exist today, systems like the Congo, the Amazon, or the Nile floods. But the general framework was the ecology of the Cretaceous, with its impossibly large fish, its flying semi-aquatic dinosaurs, and its land-based predators of terrifying scale. The name Kem Kem comes from the geological formation, the Kem Kem beds, a series of sedimentary rock layers exposed today along what is called, in a manner analogous to the swimming motion of modern aquatic animals, provided the kind of functional confirmation that moves a hypothesis from plausible interpretation to well-supported scientific conclusion. Today, the picture of Spinosaurus that has emerged from this cascade of research is of an animal unlike any other known dinosaur, a semi-aquatic giant that spent much of its life in the ancient rivers and waterways of North Africa, pursuing enormous fish with the efficiency of a crocodilian-like ambush hunter, but on a scale that exceeded any modern crocodilian by a factor of several. An animal that was not simply large, but that was specifically, exquisitely adapted for the particular ecological role it occupied in the Kem Kem ecosystem, the role of the river's dominant vertebrate predator, the creature at the apex of the aquatic food chain. The aquatic dominance of Spinosaurus in the Kem Kem River did not mean that the water was a simple or unchallenged domain. The ancient river was itself a complex ecosystem with multiple large predatory vertebrates, and understanding how these creatures coexisted requires examining the remarkable diversity of crocodilian relatives that shared the ancient waterways with Spinosaurus and with each other. Modern crocodilians, the crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and gharials that survive today, are the last representatives of a much more diverse group that, during the Mesozoic era, occupied an extraordinary range of ecological roles and body plans. The Cretaceous world in particular was home to crocodiliform archosaurs, the broader group to which true crocodilians belong of remarkable variety, some of which were fully terrestrial predators with upright posture and long legs, some of which were armored herbivores, some of which were giant aquatic predators that make even modern saltwater crocodiles look modest. In the Kem Kem, this diversity was represented by several remarkable species. The most dramatic of the Kem Kem's crocodiliform archosaurs is Sarcosuchus imperator, whose popular name, SuperCroc, captures something of the impression this animal makes on anyone encountering its remains for the first time. Sarcosuchus was genuinely enormous, with length estimates approaching 9 to 10 meters or more for the largest individuals, making it comparable in length to some modern buses. Its skull alone reached lengths of approximately 1.75 meters, and its body was heavily armored with large, interlocking osteoderms, bony plates embedded in the skin, that would have made it formidable both as a predator and as a target for any would-be attacker. Sarcosuchus is known primarily from slightly older deposits than the classic Kem Kem beds. It is most abundantly represented in the Aptian and early Albian deposits of Niger, where remarkable specimens have been recovered, but it overlaps chronologically and geographically with the Kem Kem fauna in ways that make it a relevant and important component of the broader picture.